November light lay thin over the fjord, a cold, pale skin stretched across a sea that barely breathed. Between granite walls the water held its color, iron, slate, and the slow reflection of a hulking silhouette. 52,000 tons of steel rode the swell like a coastal mountain. On her bridge, a man in a dark coat watched the bay with the certainty of someone who believed rules he had learned would keep him safe. Nets, belts of armor, smoke generators, and the shelter of the shoreline. These were not just defenses. They were a logic. They were reasons to sleep that night. What happened when that captain ignored the warning? What happened when the way of defending ships met a weapon that refused to play by the same rules? 11 minutes would answer that question in a language of steel and sand. If this story matters to you, and you want more long-form military history like this, consider subscribing now and stay with me through the whole sequence. The battleship in that fjord was not merely a single ship. In strategic terms, she was a fleet in being, a force that by existing forced choices on enemies far beyond her guns' reach. To Churchill and his admirals, she was a constant, expensive problem. She could not slog through the North Atlantic without risk, but as long as she floated in a Norwegian anchorage, Allied convoys, escort vessels, and whole carrier groups had to be assigned with an eye on the possibility she might sort out of harbor and strike. The Tirpitz, the name that shaped a disproportionate portion of British naval planning in 1942-44, tied up resources the Allies could ill afford to waste. Every escort sent north, every carrier launch kept in reserve, every convoy rerouted was a small tax levied by the mere presence of that one hull. The British response was iterative. Early attacks taught hard lessons. They tried stealth beneath the waterline. X-craft, cramped two-man midget submarines, were loaded with massive explosive charges designed to be left under a keel and detonated hours later. In September 1943, Lieutenant Donald Cameron and his crews took those tiny boats into a guarded anchorage, threaded through booms and patrols, and placed charges under the ship. The charges detonated and tore into the Tirpitz's underbelly, proving that a seaborne explosive could reach places bombs from the air struggled to reach. But the damage, while severe, did not sink her. The hull held. The ship was patched and towed. The strike solved one problem, but left the strategic one intact. They tried air power next, and they learned the limits of hitting the visible ship. Operation Tungsten, a massed carrier-based dive-bombing raid, shredded superstructure, knocked out guns, harried the crew. It was daring work at low altitude, and it hurt. But shredded superstructure is not the same as destroying a citadel. The heavily armored heart of a battleship, the magazines, machinery spaces, and armored belt, was designed to resist the kind of explosive energy dive bombers could bring. Bombs that struck the upper works caused fires and casualties, but they did not, by themselves, deliver fatal blows to an armored citadel that could shrug off much of the blast. So the Allies pushed their industrial intelligence and engineering into the fight. The question shifted from how do we get bombs to hit the ship to how do we change the physical rules that let a fortress-built ship survive. Enter Barnes Wallis, engineer, thinker of unusual metaphors, and the man who believed bombing was not only a matter of mass, but of physics applied in the right place. Wallis had already proved audacious ideas with the bouncing bomb, and later turned to a different problem: how to make a bomb that did not simply blow a hole in armor, but did its lethal work by destroying the foundation beneath that armor. The tall boy was conceived as a geological hammer. It weighed roughly 12,000 pounds, a monstrous, streamlined mass designed to punch through air, cut into earth or armor, and detonate deep below the surface. It was not merely a larger bomb, it was precision engineering, stabilized by a gyroscopic tail to ensure a nearly vertical plunge, fitted with delayed action fuses, and filled with a dense explosive charge such as Torpex. Tallboy sought to penetrate before it treated the ship as though it were sitting on a landscape rather than floating in isolation. The idea was not always to break the armor plate on impact, but to deliver an enormous shock through whatever medium supported the hull, rock, sand or soil, and through that shock to undermine the structural integrity the ship relied on. Tallboy demanded delivery crews who could fly high, steady and accurate. That meant Lancasters stripped of weight, crews trained in the new systems like the SAB's optical bombing sight for precision, and the cold calculus of flight paths that brought them under enemy flak and weather. It also demanded staging. In September and October 1944, the RAF pushed logistics to extremes. Operation Paravane was a one-way flight to Soviet bases on the Kola Peninsula. Aircraft took off loaded with tallboys, crossed long stretches of hostile airspace, and landed at primitive fields far from home. Crews labored in foreign cold. Spare parts were scarce. Navigation was exacting. The message was clear. To reach Tirpitz, the RAF would go to extraordinary lengths. Those attempts shifted the German calculus too. Damaged and repeatedly embarrassed, the battleship was moved from quieter anchorages to more exposed positions as the Germans tried to balance repair work, defensive posture, and the need to keep the ship in a place where she could still serve as a deterrent. Eventually, after damage and temporary repairs, the Tirpitz was taken to a position in Tromsø Fjorden, close to shore and in relatively shallow water. For the German command, the idea was rational. Ground the ship to present the smallest silhouette to the air. Use geography, smoke and anti-aircraft defenses to blunt an attack. And if necessary, make the ship a static, coastal battery from which she could still inflict damage on Allied forces. If mobility had become a liability for the Tirpitz, anchorage and grounding seemed a conservative, even prudent choice. That choice, however, contained a warning. The ship's defenders believed static, immobile defenses were safer when under constant air threat. The warning, the change in conditions that made that belief precarious, came in the form of a weapon that did not care whether the target floated or rested on sand. The tallboy treated the Earth as part of the target. To treat a battleship as a fortress assumes the fortress rests on solid ground or moves in a predictable medium. That assumption would be tested brutally. By November 1944, British planners had learned 3 unambiguous lessons. First, that the Tirpitz could be damaged and made vulnerable. Second, that precision, heavy ordnance delivered from high altitude could exploit previously unassailable weaknesses. And third, that weather, smokescreens, and last-minute technical failures could still rob an attack of its accuracy. The operational plan for the final attack, Operation Catechism, tried to fold these lessons together. Lancasters of 617 Squadron, veterans of precision strikes and trained with the tallboy, would mount a carefully timed attack. The aircraft would approach in tight formation, use speed and surprise, and aim for the heart of the ship and the substrate supporting her. On the morning of November 12th, crews lifted into the frost. Radio silence, precise timing, and altitude discipline were everything. For the men aboard the Tirpitz, the day began as a cold, routine watch. Smoke generators were laid out along the shore to create a rolling, artificial bank of gloom, intended to hide the ship's profile from high-flying bombers. Anti-aircraft batteries were alert. Searchlights waited. The captain walked his familiar rounds. Experience had taught him to trust the ship's layered defenses. Belt armor to resist shells and torpedoes at the waterline. Deck armor to resist plunging fire, anti-torpedo nets that gave pause to undersea attack, and the guns themselves, large, tested weapons that could in many circumstances make an enemy pay dearly for an approach. But the warning had been given, by prior raids, by damage reports, and by the very presence of the tallboy. And in that morning's calculus, the captain either underestimated how different the weapon was or believed his countermeasures would still hold. He could not know, in any precise way, how a single tallboy might change the physics beneath his ship. The attack unfolded in a compressed, brutal sequence. Aircraft came in, smoke drifted, but the wind that morning was uncooperative. Smoke generators did not lay a safe curtain from the bombing altitudes the Lancasters needed to use. Visual identification would be possible, and that is what the air crews needed. The 617 Squadron executed a low-profile preliminary path, and then a steep final attack. What flying crews called the dead man's run, a precise high-speed dive toward the release point, with each aircraft trusting their instruments and the sighting systems to do the rest. Tallboys were released from altitude. For crews below, the fall time was a measured, horrific countdown. 30 seconds is often cited as the rough time a tallboy might take from release at bombing altitude to impact, though actual times varied with release height. Those seconds were a small eternity for men in the bombsight loop and for those aboard the ship below. The first tallboy struck with the intention Wallace had designed, not merely to blow away plating, but to drive through the sand and strike at the foundations supporting the floated hulk. The bomb's streamlined body and delayed fuse allowed it to punch into the substrate and detonate at depth. The explosion did something that ordinary shells or above-deck bombs could not. It generated a ground shock that traveled through the saturated sandbank beneath the ship, locally liquefying the support and effectively removing the foundation under key parts of the hull. Imagine for a moment a dining table whose legs sit in a shallow layer of wet sand. A sudden, violent shove from beneath the sand could cause one side of the table to sag and tumble. In naval terms, it meant that floodable compartments were suddenly at hazard in ways they had not been before. The ship's buoyancy, balanced across compartments and bulkheads, became unbalanced. The first hit was followed within minutes by another. A tallboy that penetrated deck defenses detonated amidships, blowing out interior spaces and delivering catastrophic shock to structural frames. The sequence was not one single cataclysm, but a chain reaction. Shaken supports, fractured bulkheads, leak-prone openings in previously watertight sections, and the loss of counter-flooding capacity as crews struggled amid smoke and chaos. A turret, a massive assembly of guns and armor weighing hundreds of tons, was ripped from its mounts by blast effects and secondary explosions and either breached or partially ejected. Fires spread. Systems that had once allowed damage control teams to isolate and limit flooding began to fail where framing had been compromised. What the tallboys achieved in concentration was a change in the ship's center of gravity and the integrity of compartments that arrested controlled countermeasures. Flooding progressed asymmetrically. Pumps choked on debris. The crew fought with courage, moving through smoke and wreckage to patch bulkheads and rig pumps. But the Titanic-like logic of progressive flooding is unforgiving. Once a certain amount of water moves into key compartments, trim changes faster than crews can compensate. The turpits began to list. The tempo of those 11 minutes tightened. Short sentences mapped that tempo. Bomb 1, sand gives, hull support erodes, flooding begins. Bomb 2, deck ruptures, pumps fail, turret damaged, fire spreads, list increases, nearby ships send boats. Men jump or are blown into frigid water. The list becomes a roll. At some point the hull wants to roll no further and then gives, and the giant of steel turns over. This is a simplified cadence of a complex mechanical and human disaster, and historians caution against a single deterministic narrative. The most widely accepted account is that deep penetration hits undermined the sandbank and then detonated internally, producing a mixture of foundation loss and catastrophic internal structural damage that together induced the capsize. Some technical debates exist over the relative weight of each mechanism. Ground shock versus internal explosion, and eyewitness accounts can differ on detail, but the consensus is clear enough for operational conclusions. A weapon built to disengage a ship from its physical support had, in a short span, done exactly that. Casualties were severe. Sources vary on exact counts, but contemporary reports indicate that well over 1,000 men were killed, with several hundred surviving either by being rescued by escorting vessels or by making it to shore. The precise numbers fluctuate between accounts. Historians place the dead in the high hundreds to over 1,000, and survivors in the several hundreds. These figures should be verified against primary records for exactness. What is indisputable is the human cost. Men who had signed up to serve on a battleship that for years represented a strategic threat found themselves caught in a vessel that turned into a tomb. Tactically and strategically, the sinking of the Tirpitz removed a major anchor on Allied planning. The fleet in being that had forced resource allocation decisions and kept entire naval assets tied in northern waters was no more. The psychological and material impact of neutralizing such a potent symbol was significant. It let the Allies reassign escort carriers, freed convoy planners to breathe easier, and removed a provocation that had rippled across the North Atlantic war effort. Beyond that operational relief, the sinking represented a broader lesson about industrial war and the evolution of technology. The Tirpitz had been built to rules of engagement and survivability, conceived in an era when armor, displacement, and heavy guns were the primary determinants of survivability. It was designed to withstand shell fire and torpedo strikes and to fight other heavily armored opponents. But war is also an arena where industrial ingenuity can sidestep those rules. Barnes Wallis and the Tallboy did not seek to outmatch armor directly. They sought to change the environment in which armor mattered. If a battleship is a fortress, the Tallboy treated the ground under it like the fortress wall, a way to undermine strength by turning the ship's reliance on its foundation into a liability. There is a doctrinal caution here as well. Static defenses, posited as reliable because they can be fortified, armored and layered, are vulnerable to changes in adversary capability. The Germans' decision to ground the Tirpitz was understandable in its logic. It reduced exposure to torpedoes and eased repair efforts under the assumption that the ship's weight and armor would keep her safe. But a weapon that can penetrate the earth and explode beneath the hull changes the ground rules. It turns a fortress into a trap. There is also a human lesson woven through the engineering triumph. The story of Paravane crews sleeping on frozen runways in Russia, of bombers flying out of range and back under threat, of sailors fighting below decks as systems failed, of survivors pulled from icy water. All this is a brutal reminder that strategic and technical innovation unfolds amid human endurance and cost. The Tallboy is often praised as a marvel of applied physics. Its designers and delivery crews deserve recognition for ingenuity and bravery. Yet that recognition must be balanced by the names and lives caught up in the result. Historians who study the event point to persistence and iteration as central virtues in the Allied approach. The sinking was not the product of a single brilliant stroke alone. It was cumulative, lessons from tiny submarines, from dive-bombing raids, from experiments in precision bombing, and finally from a heavy ordnance program that married engineering to tactics. Each failure taught something. Each raid extracted a lesson. The final success came because the Allies refused to accept earlier limitations as immutable. In the cold arithmetic of the fjord, 11 minutes changed everything because they compressed a technological advantage into a decisive physical effect. The captain's belief in static defenses was not folly at first glance. It was, in many ways, the rational choice under older assumptions. But when an adversary develops a weapon that takes the assumptions themselves as the target, adherence to old rules becomes dangerous. The warning had been given in signs: prior damage, the movement of heavy bombs to theater, the extreme logistics required to reach the ship. Whether the captain ignored that warning in the moral sense is a complicated judgment. What is clear is that the warning was insufficiently accounted for in the face of a new kind of threat. The broader implication extends beyond one ship and one day. Warfare evolves when technology crosses thresholds that invalidate previous defensive paradigms. Armor plates that once defined survivability can be circumvented not by matching weight with weight, but by changing where force is applied. The tall boy and the concept it embodied anticipated later shifts in military thinking. Precision and physics could replace brute mass. Mobility and adaptability could trump static might. After the smoke cleared and the fjord calmed into an uneasy stillness, the strategic map had shifted. The Allies no longer had to plan with a lurking capital ship in the northern reaches. The human tally, again taken from multiple accounts, suggests that hundreds were rescued, but well over 1,000 perished, depending on the source consulted. That ambiguity in numbers is itself a reminder of the fog of war. Records are imperfect, memories fragment, and rescue operations under extreme conditions can blur exact accounting. What cannot be blurred is the outcome. A ship once thought almost invulnerable lay on her side. Her great guns pointed uselessly at the sky. When we return to the question in the title, what happened when a German captain ignored the warning? The answer is both simple and complex. In the immediate term, his decision to accept the relative safety of grounding and shore protection placed the Tirpitz into an environment where the enemy's new tool could be most effective. In the larger term, it is not a tale of personal negligence alone, but of an institutional stubbornness to adapt quickly enough to a weapon that redefined the terms of defense. The 11 minutes of catastrophic failure were the final articulation of a long strategic dialogue. Offense adapts, defense must too, or be outflanked by physics and ingenuity. There is room here for sober reflection rather than triumphalism. The sinking of a battleship is not merely a technical achievement to applaud, it is a human catastrophe, an industrial success whose ledger includes bodies and grief. The lesson for military planners and for anyone who prizes preparedness is clear. Hold your assumptions lightly. A fortress is only as invulnerable as the assumptions that underpin it are true. When those assumptions change, old safeguards can become deadly anchors. If you found this deep dive illuminating, please consider watching our next analysis on how precision bombing reshaped naval doctrine. The link in the end card will take you there. History moves in moments, and sometimes in 11 minutes, entire rules change.